Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
I'm doing well.
Yes.
Good time to start talking about foreign policy.
That's right.
As usual, or
Always
almost as usual. But once again, I would like to visit about Syria, the war that's ongoing. The war. This is Obama's war. He decided in 2011 Assad has to go, and Assad's not leaving. He's stronger than ever. And there were a lot of threats and innuendos over the last week or two, and it looks like some bombing. And the Americans were very thorough. They warned. Assad and the government, don't do this, or you're going to be in big trouble. And actually what they were warning is don't mess around with our allies like the Al-Qaeda. And what's going on there is it looks like a winding down, a wrapping up and getting rid of any Al-Qaeda that's left on the borders. And Assad and his allies are doing a pretty good job, which means Russia and others. And yet our position, the United States position, is we're sort of on the ropes, and we had to come back and say, don't do it. But then they did it. And over the weekend, matter of fact, just shortly, they were warned about this, but just within the last 24 hours, the bombing occurred and 40 people were killed. And this could be escalation, but again, nobody seems to want to escalate into something big, and there's always some excuses made. So this is still an example of what happens when you go to war for uncertain reasons, and the enemy's uncertain, and there's no end point, and they just linger on and on and on. And once again, as far as we're concerned, in the United States it's concerned, it's not a war, it's just a little bit of international police action for us to maintain our empire. So this is not a war, so it's just justified. So in some ways we talk about peace and say, hey, this is great what's going on in North Korea, that's what we want. At the same time, things seem to be exacerbating in other parts of the world, and even this battle involves Iran, and so it's a mess. But this recent bombing raises a lot of questions.
It does, and there are just a few pockets of Al Qaeda, ISIS presence left in Syria. Ironically, all of those pockets are protected by the U.S. They're literally inside U.S. protection, but. We've been following this for the past week or so, wondering when we might do a show on it. The U.S. continued to warn the Assad government, hey, don't go after this area, southwest Syria, southeast Syria. Don't go after these pockets. This is a deconfliction zone that we've determined. Here's what Heather Nauert said. She's the State Department spokesperson. The U.S. will take firm and appropriate measures in response to Syrian government violations in the area. Well, the area is their own territory, and the deconfliction zone was agreed upon, supposedly, without Syrian government participation. Number one, Syria never agreed to a deconfliction zone. And number two, even if it had, every deconfliction agreement to this point has explicitly stated this does not apply to Al-Qaeda, to ISIS, or any other organization on the U.S. terrorism list. So on two counts, she's totally misleading on this.
Well, let me read what she said to get how explicit she is on this issue. And she said this just this past Thursday when they were starting to threaten, and then they ended up doing what they threatened they would do. On Thursday, U.S. Department spokesman Heather Nauert said, any Syrian government military action against the southwest de-escalation zone risks broadening the conflict. Well, she stood up to that and said, fine. Of course, we don't have any business being there. But then she goes on to say, the United States will take firm and appropriate measures in response to Syrian government violations in the area. They're defending their country and their sovereignty, but there are violations. And then she goes on, Russia is duly responsible as a permanent member of the UN Council. The UN's coming in here. It's to use diplomatic and military influence over the Syrian government to stop attacks and compel the government to cease further military offensive. We request that Russia fulfill its commitment in accordance with UN resolution and the Southwest ceasefire arrangements. And they throw it back on the left. It's all Russia's fault. And it's something that is a gross distortion, as you were pointing out, of what's really going on.
Well, what she refers to is the so-called Da Nang Agreement, where Trump and Putin met on the sidelines of the conference there in Vietnam, and supposedly, in her telling, agreed to this de-escalation zone. But I was suspicious about this, so I went back and I read the original joint statement of Trump and Putin, and she is absolutely misinterpreting not just the spirit, but the letter of that statement. She claims that this agreement means that the Syrian government forces cannot attack remaining areas of al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria. But that's not what the statement said at all. Here's what it said, Dr. Paul. The very first sentence of the agreement, Putin and Trump, quote, confirmed their determination to defeat ISIS in Syria. That's exactly what the statement started out with, and that's exactly what the Syrian government's doing. Later on in the statement, quote, the presidents affirmed their commitment to Syria's sovereignty, unity, independence, territorial integrity, and non-sectarian character. That sounds like everything the U.S. has been fighting against. And finally, they talked about the Putin-Trump agreement in November, confirmed the importance of de-escalation zones as an interim step to reduce violence in Syria. Once again, though, al-Qaeda and ISIS never part of any deconfliction agreement.
Yeah, and you know, the real hypocrisy comes in our justification. We're there, you know, to fight for our Constitution, fight for our liberties, and get rid of al-Qaeda because al-Qaeda is the threat. But there's no evidence that we ever did anything. Al-Qaeda's losing, but it was in spite of us. There's no evidence that we did much. It was the Russians and Assad that has brought it to this point of just about ready to eliminate all influence of Al-Qaeda. But it's difficult for us and others who want to get as much truth out as possible for people to hear this, because every time you hear a report on this, it's always, you know, Russia did it, you know, and it was a Russia blame. But, you know, I want to just mention a minute about this justification, because somebody might come and say, how come you guys can argue that we shouldn't be involved there and we should start away? Well, but Russia is there. But there's a big difference between this. First off, our government has no authority to be there. Another thing is 6,000 miles away from home. There's no threat to our security, our Constitution, or our liberties. And we weren't invited to be in there, yet we're in there. Everybody knows we've been there for a long time. But on the other hand, it's close to Russia. Russia has a base there. They were invited in, and Russia was fighting al-Qaeda. And yet that information never gets out because nobody in this country wants to believe that we ever compromised ourselves on not fighting al-Qaeda. But that's the monster out there that justifies all this military activities and why we have to continue spending more and more money to make us safe. Exactly the same argument they used in the war against Hussein, you know, in Iraq.
Exactly. And anyone who knows what you've done for the past few decades would know that if the thing was turned around and if Syria was our ally and they were begging us to come in and help them, you and I would be sitting here opposing it, saying, doesn't matter if we have permission, we've got no business fighting their battle for them, shouldn't be involved. So it's regardless of that.
Right, and it is an understanding of what foreign policy should be and not. And we should be, you know, non-interventionists. We shouldn't be over there. We would be safer and freer and richer. But no, this is part of the empire. You know, and they act in behalf of the empire. What is confusing is with this administration, it's sometimes we can cheer the administration on who seems to understand that and that we should work for peace, and at other times it seems to be this escalation. And the same way, it's a determined effort because Iran is involved in this because Iran is very sympathetic. But I think there was a claim they just sent 80,000 troops into Syria, which I think is not true. But wasn't there a little bit of question, even though the bombing occurred, we threatened them, it happened, but the guilty party, the one who actually sent the bomb, there's a little uncertainty there, but it was certainly, since we did all the threatening, it had to be our effort, but some people argue, well, maybe Israel was, involved in this, but that would stretch the point because it's a little bit further away than how Israel justifies their involvement there, because they argue that they're mainly concerned about the borders near the Golan Heights, which gives them a little bit more moral authority than to go all the way off to the east.
Well, the latest numbers that I've seen, and this was in the Iranian press, is that 52 people have died in the attack. It happened this morning, Syrian time. And also, this is something else interesting, it included Iraqi military troops. So if it was the U.S., we'd actually be bombing our allied troops, the Iraqis, the people that we put into power, ironically. But the Pentagon has denied it, which makes me suspect it's probably true that we did it. But as you point out, we've been threatening for a couple of weeks. The Syrian government continues to move troops and equipment toward that area to liberate it. They've said they're going to liberate it, and then you have an attack against those troops there. So yeah, it's probably either the U.S. or the Israelis. I mean, who else could it be?
One of the justifications from the neocons is, well, this guy's a monster. He gasses his own people. He's a vicious dictator, and we have to take care of him. At the same time, we have talked to dictators for a long time. Chinese dictators, Soviet dictators, Korean dictators. Yeah. So it has nothing to do with dictators. For decades, we were friends with Saddam Hussein. He was a dictator, but all of a sudden, conditions changed and we became his arch enemy and we got rid of him. So it has nothing to do with this attitude, trying to get the moral high ground by saying, oh, well, we're stopping some evil monster from killing all his own people. But it goes on incessantly. And I think most Americans, just turn a blind ear to that. They don't listen to it. They don't care about it. It doesn't affect them. And others say, well, that's probably true. We have to believe them. And then there's a few that pay attention to what we're doing and others like us, because we're by far not the only ones who talk about non-intervention. Matter of fact, this is one thing that we should be a little bit excited about. There are more and more groups now speaking out. It's just that we don't get on the evening news and we get to talk to a broader audience. The establishment gets to control that. But in spite of the shortcomings of what happens on the internet and social news networks, we still are able to get a message out. And I think this is so much better than it was when there were only 3 TV stations.
Although they are trying to shut us down and silence us. But it's interesting you mentioned this whole idea that that these irrational dictator, we can't talk to them, can't do anything. It's always a propaganda tool that they use. Saddam Hussein, Kim Jong-un, they're all irrational dictators. We don't dare talk to them. And it's to convince us that we should only use force. But think about Assad. If he really was a totally irrational, crazed dictator, maybe he would have actually allied with ISIS and Al-Qaeda and just blew up the whole region, attacked Israel, done all these things. If anything, he's acted in a very careful way, in really objectively what is in his own national interest, which is to get rid of these foreign invaders, foreign-backed invaders. So if looking at it objectively, he's acted like a really irrational actor.
Yeah, I just wonder whether or not they might not have a subtle endorsement of the Monroe Doctrine, which was established early in our history. But, in a way, that's what it is. It's his territory. When the issue came up with Ukraine and Crimea, was, from his viewpoint, he wasn't acting like a Soviet invasion army invading Poland. And yet right now they're talking about us sending more Marines to Norway to protect Norway against the coming invasion by Russia. I mean, how absurd could that possibly be true? What are the odds of that happening? It seems pretty slim.
Like, what's Russia going to do? Hey, we got Norway. I mean, what happens next? What happens on day 2?
But the whole thing is I didn't even know how many Marines we already had there. So now we're sending more Marines there. But it's all propaganda to paint the Russians as bad people. But did you see what we did this week, which I think is interesting, because we want trade and dependency on each other, and our space program depends on the rockets from Russia. And we just received some rockets from Russia, and they got some money from us. So at the same time, you almost think that they're playing us for fools. And instead of trying to get people to think, in terms of what would it be like to have a non-interventionist foreign policy designed to protect the safety and security of the United States and be concerned about the Constitution and civil liberties here at home, because we do know that under all wars, the more legitimate wars, so-called, versus these illegitimate wars, civil liberties are always threatened. The reason why we're under the greatest amount of threat right now is we're in perpetual war. And they said the global war on terrorism is forever. And that's why they don't want to ever see the terrorists defeated. But it's because there's a global war on terrorism, we still have to put up with the TSA, you know, at the airports, and the NSA, and all the things going on, because we're in perpetual war and we have to protect the liberties against the invaders. What we need is a better understanding to protect ourselves against the or the threat to our liberties by our own government. But if you say that, you know, you're not a very nice person. But truth should be acceptable. If they want to refute that, they should refute, you know, the greatness of the Patriot Act. Why you should be endorsing that, and why I should change my mind. I shouldn't have voted against it, because that's what a true patriot would do.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you know, I just got back from Washington. I can tell you, there's lots of money in having enemies. You know, as you're driving along, going toward the National Airport, there's a big new Boeing building, you know, that looms over you. But you mentioned that, you know, our ability to get the message out in the social media, and we have some challenges, and we've been talking about some of those challenges and some of the crackdowns, and a lot of it's being done with government money. I just sent out an update to our subscribers about how U.S. government-funded think tanks are trying to silence the social media that opposes U.S. foreign policy, and that's us. But again, at the risk of saying it once again, that's why we're meeting in August, and we would like to see all of you there. We're putting together a great program August 18th in Washington, D.C., taking the fight to so-called enemy territory.
There you go. And I want to thank our audience for joining with us today. And I want to once again emphasize the importance of this issue that we talk about here on our program, and what Daniel does on the RPI Institute website. And it's to get the information out, because I'm a true believer that education is the solution to this, whether it's economic or foreign policy. That you can't say all we need is a couple new people in Washington, different politicians with better management skills. That's not the answer. We have to change people's minds and attitudes and the hearts of people to understand why free markets are better than the kind of markets that we have, that sound money is better than fiat money, that national sovereignty designed to protect liberty is much better than an empire. All these things can be done by explaining the issues to the people, and it's an understanding. That's why I think education is important, and we design that, and that is why we have the conferences, and I think that's where we're making our progress, because certainly, in spite of all the shortcomings that we talk about, it is so different than when I first got involved in politics back in the 70s. There's a better understanding of the Federal Reserve System. There's a better understanding about the nature of our government. There's more skepticism of our government, and we complain that the propagandists have total control, but not quite so. There's a lot of people now, a lot more people now, who question what our government's doing. So there's signs out there for us to be optimistic, and I hope we can participate in promoting those viewpoints. I do want to thank everybody for joining us today with the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.